Writers' Centre, or the room in which the Writers' Centre events take place. It's great to have Lucy Caldwell here. Some of you may have heard her talking to the MA Creative Writing Group a bit earlier, where she was talking about her love of short stories, but I think principally, and by the way, you may have some questions you didn't get time to ask in that session, in which case I'm going to allow plenty of time for questions. But we're here principally to talk about a novel which came out earlier this year, terrific novel these days. If the Booker Prize weren't so overwhelmed by Americans now, it would have been on the long list or the short list or something. Certainly deserved to be. But if you look at Lucy's profile, you'll see that she's also a dramatist. She's published 3 novels before this, I think I'm right in saying, 2 collections of short stories, but has had a series of plays on at the Royal Court and internationally. And to strike a personal note, when she was one of the first students I had when I arrived here, a very long time ago, 2003, and I was struck by, and you work with creative writing students sometimes, bright though they are, they're a bit slow to take up the editorial suggestions. Lucy was, almost before I suggested something, she would have already thought of that, and the next draft would include the change and a lot more besides. And I realised this was a very talented writer who was cramming in, at the same time as doing the MA in Creative Writing here, a playwright course at the Royal Court. A lot to do in a year, but during that year she was taken on by an agent, and almost immediately after the MA she was signed up by Faber for her first novel. So, very nice.
I was thinking, like, I always feel such a sort of squirming sense of apology, because I remember I did that thing that as a creative writing tutor myself, you say you can submit like up to 2,000 words or 3,000 words, whatever. And I would send you sort of unapologetically double that and say, well, it doesn't possibly make sense if you don't have the rest of the chapter.
Yeah.
And like the one thing that you sort of must not do as a creative writing student. And you never once said, sorry, I stopped reading the whatever.
No, I read the whole lot. It was good.
I'm always so grateful for that.
Yeah, and it was what became your first novel, what you were working on then.
Yeah.
But just tell us a little bit about this one to begin with, in general about it. I read somewhere that you wrote the first draft in 11 weeks.
Yeah, it was the sort of, things often have a very slow and tangled genesis, and I'd been writing almost only short stories for years, partly because my children were young and I was looking after them, and which was a true choice, but for a novel to work, you need to be able to plod away at it all day, every day. You can't. I used to have a quote back when I was studying here by Walter Mosley, the great crime writer, pinned to my notice board, and he said exactly that. He said you have to work every day, and he said if you don't, what you're writing just turns to smoke. And it's true that if you're working on a novel, you just need to keep it alive every day. And I hadn't been able to do that, and short stories I found that I could hold myself sort of psychically open for the duration of the extent of the capacity of a single short story. And I could write it in very intense, concentrated bursts, and just, my life just did not allow for the writing of a novel. And also, I've been trying to write short stories for years, and they hadn't been working, and finally they were, and I was intoxicated with that, so I had no plan to write a novel. But at that time, when my son was 2, he was obsessed for a while with a book called Peepo by Janet and Alan Albert. It's a lovely book, and it goes, here's little baby, 1, 2, 3, sits in his cot, what's he see? And it's a child's life, but in the background there's the London Blitz. There's Zeppelin in the sky, bombed out buildings, the father at the end is dressed in uniform, and you're not sure if he's going away to fight or, So it was one of those books that I had to read to my son every night for months and months on end. And it was one of those books that, as I was reading it to him, in our flat, which was in an area of East London that had been devastated by the bombs, I was thinking how so many of my favourite writers, like Rosamund Lehman and Elizabeth Bowen and Virginia Woolf and Louis MacNeice and Henry Green and Graham Greene, they're all great writers of the London Blitz. And I was lying there thinking about that as I read to William and thinking of the vagaries of chance that in that building we would have survived everything the Luftwaffe literally had to throw at us. But ours was the only building in the street, only building for several streets that had survived. And then I was thinking about, coming from the place and time that I come from. I was thinking of the vagaries of chance that mean that you run the way they tell you to, or you run the opposite way, or you're 5 minutes early, or you're 5 minutes late, or you decide to get a fish supper that night, or you don't, or all of those sort of things. And I started to think there was a Belfast Blitz, because I could remember my grandma had never particularly liked to talk about it, so I'd never asked her, but I remembered that she had stories. And my dad still has stories of his uncles, running up and collecting shrapnel from a plane that crashed into the Black Mountain, all that sort of thing. And so I thought maybe there's a short story in it. I can't remember reading it in fiction. So I started looking in fiction, and there's only one novel by Brian Moore called Emperor of Ice Cream, set during the Belfast Blitz. And I found that extraordinary because the more research I did, the Belfast Blitz, it was the worst blitz in the UK outside of one or two of the London blitzes, in terms of devastation, in terms of loss of civilian life, loss of life. And there are Luftwaffe pilots on record saying, when they oversee Belfast in flames, like, my God, what have we done? Hitler, in fact, ordered the news of the bombing of Belfast to be suppressed because it was so bad, he was worried that it would be the final thing that sent the US into war. They did come into war, several months later, but so it was this thing that I thought no one has told this story. So at this point, I did still think that there would be a short story in it somewhere, and so I started researching. I started reading history books. I started, looking at online archives and oral history archives. And by this point, we're now in the spring of 2020, and as COVID came closer and closer, there was and as it became inevitable. There was a lot of talk of Blitz spirit, and we're best in the Blitz spirit and we'll get through this. And it was kind of idle talk, and suddenly I felt I understood the Blitz more profoundly differently. And I understood it was nothing to do with, the making a cup of tea and the keeping your chin up. It was that you have no idea how far in this thing you are. Like, we look at the Blitz as a period, a discrete period that's over. But for the people experiencing it, you don't know, as we didn't at the start of COVID, was this to be the rest of our lives? Was this going to be 3 weeks and then we'd get back to normal? Were we going to be back to normal by the summer or by September? And I was feeling my own collection of stories was due to be out that May, and Faber delayed it till July, then they delayed it till September, then they delayed. And there was this feeling of, we didn't know how far in this process we were, and we didn't know, if death was going to visit our households that night or not. And so there was a sense of everyday life being suspended, but also of it being impossible. The epigraph that I took from my novel, one of them is a beautiful letter by Sylvia Townsend Warner, who I love, and she says, no one feels well or happy just now. No one in wartime can quite escape the illusion that when the war ends, things will snap back to where they were, and that one will be the same age one was when it began, and able to go on from where one left off. But the Temple of Janus has 2 doors, and the door for war and door for peace are equally marked in plain lettering, no way back. And the dead are not more irrevocably dead than the living are irrevocably alive. That's just from one of her private letters, but it seemed to me that summed up what it was like living through lockdown and living through COVID. And so at this point, I was interviewing people about their Blitz experiences, people who were in their 80s, 90s, one woman who was 103, about what they remembered. But it took on a new urgency because I was suddenly not wanting their stories for themselves, but I was wanting their stories thinking, what are my children who are 2 and 5 going to remember of this time? How are we going to get through? And a weird overlap happened where, our first lockdown was April to May, and the Belfast Blitz was April to May. So it felt at times almost like I was writing it in real time. It felt as if, I remember this, and I would write it, my husband and I, we divided up the day, and I took the morning, because I'm best in the morning, and so I had from whatever I got up, which with young children in summer is like 6 o'clock, and I'd have till like 11:45 when you have lunch if you've got young kids. So that was my every day of the week, I'd be there, and I'd try to take Sunday off, but I'd be so antsy. Tom would say, just go back to 1941 for a couple of hours and we'll be happier. And so suddenly the conditions were right, and the story seemed to take on a new resonance. In that way that I think any historian, if you're writing, like Amadeus tells us more about the 80s than it does Mozart, sort of thing. So this felt to me like I was writing very much about these days.
And talking about it as a Blitz novel, which it is, might suggest vast amounts of historical detail and so on, and that's there. But you focus it by having two young women. They're at the centre of this. You decided really to make one family, their sisters, the centre of the story. Do you want to talk a little bit about that decision?
Yeah, I mean, I loved all the process of research, and I loved one of the stages of research that I loved was, say, combing through Virginia Woolf's diaries and letters and seeing when she says looking glass rather than mirror, or just getting those precise details right, or wristwatch, not watch. And so technically it was really satisfying because you want to evoke the period, but too much starts to sound like pastiche. So that was really interesting, the sort of technical, all the research was interesting, the technical stuff was interesting, but for it to have a story might be a really good story, but as we know, it doesn't necessarily make good fiction. Or the amount of times that someone's piece will be working and they say, but that's how it happened. And you think that's a curious thing that something is different is needed in fiction. And so, amazing as so many of the stories I heard were, they're inert unless they start to work as fiction. And so my way into the Blitz was, I have two sisters at the heart of the novel, and their mother. About a third of the way through, the narrative opens up to take in their mother's perspective, and through the course of the April to May and the Blitz, the different paths that the sisters take, I hoped encompass a whole city. So I sort of thought of it as concentric circles, that would allow me to take in mainly the woman, but the whole city.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about these two and not too many spoilers, but just the sisters and why you made them who they are?
Yeah. So Audrey, she turns 21 when the novel opens, and she is engaged to be married to a doctor. Her father's a doctor, and she is she's not letting herself know how stifled and miserable and unhappy she is by her life. And
Which was an interesting challenge for you as to how much you alert the reader of the little clues that maybe
exactly. And
the reader's perhaps acknowledging things that she isn't.
Yeah, and I was thinking of the extent to which something like the Blitz or war or pandemic, the way it disrupts the normal grooves of your life. Something that happened in the pandemic that was so interesting was the amount of relationships that fell apart, and the corollary of that, the amount that suddenly became very fast, very intense. The way that people made decisions about the ways that they were living their life, that in peacetime or outside of the pandemic, they might have just carried on in the groove of their lives for a long time, without having the opportunity or the pressure, without being able to realise. And that's very much the case for Audrey. And her sister Emma is the opposite. She's very unhappy. She's 19 and she's unhappy and doesn't know what she wants to do with her life. And Emma came from, when I was doing my research, I saw all these photographs of women who, say, would be driving ambulances, or who, my own mum's mum, she was Rosie. I always used to think she was the Rosie the Riveter because her name was Rosina. There was a picture of her in a factory, And all the women who, otherwise, they weren't allowed jobs in the public sphere. There would have been no reason for them to be, their lives would have been cramped in all sorts of ways. But suddenly the war gave them a reason to be driving the ambulance, or on the domestic front, or encountering people in a way that they wouldn't encounter them before. And there's a book by Lara Fagel called The Love Charms of Bonds that's about that sort of London set of writers and their love affairs and the way that they survived during the Blitz, and the way that relationships can flare very, very intensely in a very intoxicating way during these circumstances where you're very intensely with someone and you're with someone in the midst of life and death and the world might be ending around you. And as a novelist, of course, that's useful because you can cut right to the quick of things. And so Emma falls in love with her supervisor, who's a woman called Sylvia, and they have a brief. You were meant to discover this kind of further on into the novel, but then Faber put it in the in the blurb. But yeah, so the sisters, one of them has a relationship that falls apart over the course of the novel, and the other has so that I set those two through emotions.
And things flare up for the mother as well, in a way. I mean, she's thinking back another relationship.
I had the idea that for the sisters, they're very young, and with the novel, I thought what the novel can do that a short story can't is because it's got time on its side, you can show sort of slow unfolding of consciousness over time. And for each of these sisters, they're so absorbed in their own world and their own dramas. To them, mother is just mother.
Yeah.
She manages to make her disapproval clear with the angle of her knitting needles. And I wanted this feeling that a third of the way through the novel, the mother suddenly opens up to us as a character. And she was, I think, maybe my favourite character to write, her sort of quiet melancholy, where you realise that the mother, Florence, she is of that generation who lost so many during the Great War. And Florence lost the love of her life when she was very young. And she thinks she's one of the lucky ones because she did marry and she's had children and she's married up and she's got a respectable middle-class life and she has her children and she has no reason to be unhappy. And yet she feels like she's just been going through the motions of her life for her whole life. And so again, the war, which for her is, she lost her love to the Great War. And so now there's another, the war has come again and it's forcing her to assess what she's done with her life. Or, the part of her soul that died, that has stopped her from, the part of her soul that's still the lover who died, that has really stopped her from being present in her life.
Yeah, so you feel there's a turning point for her as well as for them. I mean, there's a feeling with all three of them they're coming into their own in some way by the end. Do you want to read an extract just to give a flavour for people?
I'll read a short excerpt. This is from the aftermath of one of the raids. Night falls. In bed, unable to sleep, Florin thinks of all of those across the city who must also be awake. Thousands must have bedded down in the houses of relatives, neighbours, friends. Weans tucked in cots and camping beds top to tail. Old pallets pulled from sheds and lined with overcoats. Piles of gamzees on the floor as makeshift bedding. Thousands more will be in the temporary shelter of church and school halls. Thousands have left the city, of course. So many that by early afternoon they say the railway stations had to close. So many there were queues a mile long at all the main bus stops. She went with Philip as he drove Maisie and her mother back home, struck with a sudden fear that something had happened to him, that he was too tired really to be driving again, and driving back from North Belfast they saw the exodus. Cars, carts, bicycles, perambulators, bath chairs, even children's bogey carts, anything with wheels has been pressed into service, loaded with human and material flotsam, leaving the city. The rag and bone men, the coke men, the oil fellows with their ice cream tracks, the woman sells art glass herrings door to door from the panniers in the back of her donkey. All of them seem to have taken to the roads, belongings tied up hastily in scattered parcels. Others trailed boxes with rope, like cart horses themselves, or had pillowcases slung over their shoulders, or shawls tied to their backs, stuffed with, who knows, family photo albums, tins of luncheon meat, loaves of bread. The countryside, all of the countryside, from Carryduff to Cultrall, must be simply besieged, she thinks. Trudging feet, crying children, faces graven with despair. There won't be anywhere for them to stay. Thousands must simply have taken to the brick fields or the mountainside to find a barn to sleep in, or a ditch, or simply to walk all night, taking their chances with the elements. For some, she thinks, the fear of being strafed or machine gunned by the Luftwaffe must be less than the abject terror of being buried inside or burned alive should the bombers come again. For others, there is no choice. they've lost their homes, their streets, their everything. It was a kind of curious thing because, I wrote this novel and it felt very much a COVID novel, written during lockdown. And it felt as if, I remember this really eerie feeling that, this feeling of all times coexisting at once. And it being possible to tune out of yours and tune into another time. I had this feeling of my characters. I remember, you could feel it in the air. I remember the 8th of April was the day in our timeline when the death toll passed 1,000 for the first time. And you could feel it. I remember wherever you were, it was palpable in the air. And on that day, I was writing the aftermath of the first raid in Belfast, when people were realising for the first time how serious this thing was, and that there was no staving it off, and it had come and it would come again. And the time that I was writing, there's a passage in the book where the raids, the worst raid has happened. All of the city is devastated. Like the comms are down, the newspaper printing presses have been mined, like the streets are rivers of margarine on flames and fire. And the red phone goes on the desk of the head of the civil service, Wilfred Spender, and he picks it up, and it's Churchill. And he thinks like, thank God, Winston. And Churchill says, what are you doing to protect the statue of Edward Carson in Stormont? The statue must not be allowed to fall. On the day that I was writing that scene, they were toppling the statue of Coulson into Bristol Harbour. And so you start to feel, am I somehow causing this? Am I, should I stop doing this? Things are coming together, which is causing which? And then, of course, I was writing a scene where all of the upper class, to keep up morale, are holding these drinks parties. And of course, they didn't know at the time, that's exactly what they... So there was this weird thing that the time seemed to be doing such strange things. And then the world that the novel was published into, I landed in Berlin to give my first reading from this novel the week it was published, on the day that war was declared in Ukraine. And so suddenly, you're writing about a city under aerial bombardment and refugees, and I remember at the time there were those images of the train platforms and people struggling to get on. Images that could have been Second World War, it could have been, and I remember reading tweets from people that were so moving, from Ukrainian people that were saying, you're about to see images of us as refugees, and war-torn cities, but up until this moment, we are just living our normal lives. We're doing, prom, we're taking our children to their ballet lessons. We are not the victims you're about to see us as, or we're more than that as well. And it felt so strange to, you have, sometimes like Henry James has that wonderful image in The Art of Fiction of the writer as a spider's web. You have to catch in all the impulses of the air. And sometimes you do try to be like that, to sort of, spread yourself to catch anything that might be going on, and you can't be in control of the circumstances into which your book is published. But
when it comes together as quickly as it did, and when everything seems resonant to the present moment, is that when you think, I do have a muse. I believe in inspiration.
I don't believe in the muse as you just wait at your desk till she taps you on the shoulder sort of thing. I think that you do have to create the conditions. You do have to ring fence and make the time that you do it. But it is something that you can be, as that Henry James image goes. If he says a writer is someone on whom nothing is lost, someone who can convert the very pulses of the air into story. And I think there's a way of, one of the things that I think I most love about writing is the excuse it gives you to be in the world. I went earlier on this year to CERN, to the Large Hadron Collider, to talk with quantum physicists at the very top of their game about what they're doing. I've been around sort of a travelling fairground talking with someone who his job is to paint the horses. You get, if you're a writer, you have the excuse to be so present in the world, and people offer you their stories and they tell you their stories. And sometimes I think that's one of the writing itself is only the excuse. The writing is the reason to be able to be in the world. And I think, and sometimes, I've come to realise that towards the end of a project, you do seem to get, or at least I seem to get, this sense of terminal velocity. where everything suddenly, it's a sort of, your mind is working at the speed of, at hyper speed, and everything you read, everything you do seems connected, everything feeds into the book in a way that is, we understand so little about creativity, and maybe it is more akin to a sort of schizophrenia, sort of manicness or something, but it makes sense. And at that time, you need to protect your story from the people that you might meet, or the things you might read, or the things you might see, because everything will seem relevant, everything will find its way in. And so I think, there are different stages of the writing process and the arc of everything for me. But I do think that, you can be open to what's going on in the world, even in ways that you don't quite understand. Be energetically open, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's striking about the thing also is the sheer detail about Belfast, the streets, if you like, the topography of it. And I mean, you grew up there, but that at a much later point, and 40 years on from when the novel's set, and the city would have changed. So I just wondered how you managed to accumulate all that detail, whether you keep maps at home or how.
Yeah, well, actually, it's quite hard to get maps, because of course they destroyed so many of the ordnance maps, so they didn't fall into the wrong hands before the war. But I did manage to get a facsimile of, I think, a 1939 map. That was really useful because on the opposite side it had, what all the haberdashers were and all the stores. It was really useful. And what I did is I did those journeys, because it's very much a book of the city. And I felt funny. I'd never thought that I would write Belfast again, because my stories had been moving further away. And it had been a sort of sadness that I hadn't written like a big Belfast novel. But suddenly there was something about being in lockdown that London always feels very close to Belfast, especially if your parents are still there and you go back and forth. But suddenly there was that thing that happened in lockdown where you realise that a plane suddenly becomes a short plane, or a short boat becomes a big, big journey. And so I couldn't move. None of us could. I couldn't leave my flat. But I was able to use my ordnance maps and use Google Maps. What I did is I would send my dad on my mum on research missions. It's set in East Belfast, and of course the amazing thing is we were in April to May. The book was set between April to May, and say some of the trees on the streets in the part of Belfast I'm describing were planted to commemorate Napoleon's victory in Waterloo. So they're still the same. You know that those are literally the same trees if they've survived. And so I would say to my dad, walk to this particular point and turn and look left up at the hills, C.S. Lewis's Green Hills. What trees can you see, and to what extent are they in leaf? And so I would do that, and then when you could travel a bit more, I would say to my dad, okay, go to St George's Market, come out the main entrance. Imagine that you're so ravaged by grief you might throw yourself into the Lagan. Pretend that the contemporary law courts aren't there. What's your closest route to the river? So I sort of did that, and then as soon as I was able to walk the streets again, I did. I walked every journey that's in the book to check that it could be done and done in that way. I walked some of them with the writer Glenn Patterson. He's a novelist. He's written historically. He knows more about Belfast than almost anyone, and so I checked things with him. But it did feel a way of sort of psychically keeping the city close and keeping the city alive for me at a time when I felt, as we all did, completely cut off.
Yeah, so you're not really James Joyce detached from Dublin, but you did come to London and a long time ago. I mean,
yeah, and his letters, I think he sends letters and they say, go to this particular building and check the iron railings, and how far from the ground are they? Would it be possible for someone to impale themselves on them? And it's that same sort of thing you need to get right.
And you got very obliging parents who carried out your missions for you.
Yeah.
Do you think that writing short stories had an effect in composing this novel? You'd had a bit of a break from the previous novel, and whether in terms of economy or in some other way, all that discipline, your short stories coming together, you win the BBC Short Story Prize, you're on top form with stories, and then you write this novel. I mean,
yeah, I think stories, they're such an exacting form. I think that if you can write and practice and get better at short stories, it will only help your prose writing. I've always been, all of my novels are quite tightly controlled formally. You know, like that I've always, and maybe that's the playwright in me as well, you know, I've always seen them in acts and in parts. I've never, even if my first drafts are really, really messy, I always have a sense of the shape of the thing, or I have a sense of the act, or I have a sense of the form of it. And so, and with this novel, it's funny, my first draft of it, there was a sort of stand-in character for me. I'm going to sound so bad when I say it to you, it's a surprise, I didn't realise it earlier, but there was a sort of stand-in character in the present day, in the pandemic, you know, writing this novel about the Belfast Blitz and trying to get back in time and trying to, and in the first draft of my novel there was that sort of there as well. And then I realised I couldn't make it work, I couldn't make it balance. I tried, you know, shortening the contemporary day passages, I tried extending them, I tried all sorts of things, and then I finally realised one day that it was as if the whole thing had just been, the image that I came up with was, it was born in its coal, you know, and if you stripped away all of that, you just had a sort of pretty traditional historical novel at its heart. And when I realised that, characters started coming to life in more interesting ways, you know, with the sort of narrator, me there, like, you know, anxiously breathing over their shoulder. They hadn't been able to come to life, but suddenly, when I took myself away, they were able to. And I think that's something that, again, I was conscious of. The novel can do that, you know, a short story, everything is more pressured. And the novel, you can show change over time.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck by the tight control of it because there's a chapter early on where there's a character we haven't met before, a girl, Maisie, on a train, and you sort of think, I wonder why this has come in, it doesn't seem to belong. And then, of course, she comes back during one of the raids and plays a really key part in the novel in a way. I mean, Audrey's brief relationship with her, taking care of her, actually has an effect, which Audrey mentions later, isn't it? And so on.
Yeah, there's,
so everything plays a part, is what
it does, and one of the most valuable pieces of information I've ever had about writing came from the theatre director, Ian Rickson, and he said, there's no such thing as a minor character. You know, it might be that for the sake of this play, these are the characters who we're focused in on, but you can never have a character whose function is just to deliver a line to the main character. We need to have the sense that they change over the course of the, you know, the thing, the play or the novel, or that if we switched angles, their story, as everyone, you know, there's no one who has a boring life, you know, there's no such thing as an ordinary person. People, the depths and the stories, the secrets that every single person contains, you know, I wanted the sense that even though the story is mainly focused through my two sisters and their mother, even the minor characters that we encounter, they're minor only in terms of time allotted or page count, you know, but they have to be as alive as any of the others, and they have to change, and they can't be there just to serve the main characters.
And you do manage to cover the effect of war on children to some extent through Maisie, but also Emma and Audrey have a brother who's, I think, 14, a teenage brother, and who wants to be a fighter pilot, who's excited by the war. And then, of course, you've got the two doctors, their father, but also Audrey's fiancé. So, although women are at the centre of this, you know, there are men there and there are the children there, you are dealing with a wide range of people.
Yeah.
Do you have a second extract, I think?
Yeah, I have a short second extract that I was going to read, and this is one of the more minor characters. She's just the family's little maid, and so this is there's an extraordinary true story that I encountered, that I wrote in and I gave to this little character, Betty Binks, and it was a man had a vision, a man who was one of the ship workers in the docks, and he had a vision before the Belfast Blitz happened of coffins falling down from the sky, And so he got a joiner friend of his, to take off his front door and use it to reinforce the kitchen table. And of course, the whole family thought he was completely mad, that he took off their front door. And then only a few days after that, the first air raid came, and so many of the houses in the street were just flattened. But his family, all of his family and children survived because they hid under this reinforced table. And it was too good a story not to use. And so I gave this story to the little maid. So after the first bombing raid, this is what happens to her. And she's convinced that her father's had a vision, and she's been spared, because her life is to hold greater things. But this is her. And I realised sometimes, like with my story, All the People I Mean and Bad, that won the BBC Prize, I wrote that story very quickly. I wrote it in about 2 days, the first draft of it. But I thought about that story. I turned it over in my mind intensively for about a year before writing it. And when I was able to write it, it was when I was suddenly able to hear that the tone of that story is one of elegy. It starts off, 2 weeks after your cousin dies, you're on a night flight back to London from Toronto. And I realised, okay, so this is an elegy. It's literally an elegy because the character is grieving her cousin, but it's also an elegy because on this flight, she grieves all the people that she thought she might be and isn't. She grieves, all the people that she will no longer love or no longer be. She's grieving, all the distance between where she came from and where she is now, between who she thought she was and who she ended up. And as soon as I could hear that tone of elegy, I wrote that. I could write the story, just clicked. I could write it. I could hear it. And there was a similar thing for this novel. I was writing. It was the Belfast Blitz, and it hadn't been written in fiction, and I needed to somehow, honour that and rise to that. Also, I wanted to find a way of honouring the people that I spoke to, because I was speaking to people in their 80s and 90s, and it got this urgency because, of course, in those first days, those were the people we were losing, the elderly people, the people in the care homes, the people that were unprotected. Occasionally I would set up, a time to phone someone or to speak to someone, or I'd have a conversation with someone and she'd say, look, love, I'm going to write all this down for you. And then that letter would never come. The phone conversation, it wouldn't happen, the person had died. So I had this sense as well of, when I was collecting these stories, they became really precious, and I had the sense that I wanted to have an element of elegy or memorialise. So I did that with this character, Betty Binks. And for any of you who were in my short story seminar earlier, when I was talking about different form and how you can deploy different form, at certain points of the novel, this is just a 2-page section that sort of does that. You'll hear the rhythms of it. So, wee Betty Binks then, gone along with her dreams of growing taller, her ambitions to take over the running of the big house, to take possession of the hand-me-downs and the excess jars of preserves and veg. Gone her apron and cap and bobby pins, and gone her drawer of sticking plaster strips. Gone the chipped enamel pudding basin that her ma would send them out with for a block of ice cream on a Sunday from the man come round on his trike. Gone the big oak press taking up half the front bedroom where each of them had slept as babies, snug in the bottom drawer. Gone the knitted swimsuits, saggier by each sister, that her ma had made for the annual day trip to Bangor. Gone her treasures, her Sunday school book for good attendance, with its coloured plates, the story of Pegasus, the winged horse who fell from the sky, and her sister Clara's Heidi. Gone the big family Bible with all the Binks' names written in, going back up past her father to his grandfather, his, which would be hers one day. Gone the look on her dad's face when the great hooting siren would sound out over the docks, and he'd haul himself to the doorway to watch the shipyard workers streaming home, striding easily, laughing and talking, groups of 3 or 4, boots, jackets, flat tweed caps, some for home, some for a swift pint before their dinner, and he'd sit in the doorway in his chair, and they'd raise a hand to him, Evening John, and she'd rest her head against his shoulder and feel how much he missed it all. Go on the time he took her, aged only 7 or 8, to Queen's Island, to the Thompson graving dock, to see where the great ships had been built and launched from. And walking home, they'd stop by the Queen's Quay, the coal quay, as it was colloquially known, to watch the heaps of dark glittering coal unloaded from the snub-nosed tugboats with their bright red funnels. the bright glinting light on the water, the sudden soot-brick shadows in the arches of the bridge, 2 men rowing a boat underneath. The way he pointed to the hazy city beyond the bridge, beyond it the gasworks, smoke tumbling upwards from the tall chimneys, beyond them the hills, and he'd said, "This is your city, Betty, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Gone. Gone the bogey cart her dad made them out of wooden boxes and old pram wheels and a rope. Gone the lamppost with the crossbeam, the old Victorian sort, that the lamplighters used to light at dusk, and which she and all the other children in the street used to swing around, and sometimes, despite herself, she still did. Gone the feel of the lips of the horses in the builder's yard, who would put their big velvety heads down to eat the crusts of bread or the handfuls of grass you pulled for them, managing to eat it even round the bit in their mouths. Gone the breath of your wee sisters as they toddled across the floor and got into bed with you in the night, twisting at a strand of your hair until they fell asleep. Gone the triumph of sailing a paper boat all the way down the gully at the back of the wasteland where the water from the houses ran. Gone, all of it gone, and with barely anyone to know or to mark it. So that felt very much like, one of the things that I was trying to do was to do this thing that fiction can do, to capture and preserve and elegize.
And commemorate, and do honour to people who have gone, and in that sense you could say it's a historical novel. And I notice you've got Hilary Mantel, Rosie Thomas France, Tracy Chevalier as well, and yet from all you said, you don't think of it, especially as a historical novel, you think of it as being as much about now as about
do you
then.
know what? I think if I'm writing a story set in 2003, it's a historical story, because I have to think, okay, so then, like, what were our mobile phones? Had they got so small, they were like smaller than a credit card and you couldn't use them, or had they got so small they couldn't get any smaller and they were starting to get big again? In 2003, would I have still used a London A to Z? Or was Google Maps a thing yet, or wasn't it? So I think if you're writing, the precision of that detail really matters. And so, yes, in some ways it's historical because I guess historical it's not within my lifetime. But at the same time, it felt, there's a phrase that Sylvia Townsend, Warner's biographer, uses, which is fingertip history, which is history, it's close enough that you can just about touch it. And I felt that talking to people, it felt like I wasn't trying to recreate a historical period that's completely dead and gone. I could still just about touch it. I could talk to people for whom it was their life. So it felt, it didn't feel massively different to writing, other things that I've written.
I mean, people say, we were saying at the time, Belfast is finished, but it isn't. It's in this novel. Right, we've got time for questions. Yeah.
You speak a lot about COVID when you were writing this novel. Do you think you would ever write a COVID-19 related story or novel?
It's interesting, it's this huge thing that we've lived. I mean, there have been some novels already, very much about it. I think it's an interesting question now I find in my short stories. When you can't just set it in some kind of like amorphous recent past, you need to decide. But I've just finished a short story that is set very precisely at the period where, between lockdowns, when I have a sister in Australia, and it was a moment where Australia had opened up their borders for, you could leave, but unless you had citizenship, you weren't guaranteed that you could go back in. And so I've written a story there's a woman whose mother is in Australia who's dying, and she cannot visit her mother, and she's waiting she's desperately trying to apply for Australian citizenship, because if you're a citizen, you're allowed in through the border, and then you quarantine for a month, and for her it's a race against time of, will the rules change, and will the quarantine rules change, and so I use it kind of quite specifically, a particular moment. I find it so interesting the way, we look back now as the pandemic as a sort of blur, but I find it so interesting to remember, say, the time when my husband would go and do shopping for like 3 days, which was about as much as he could carry or we could store, from the corner Sainsbury's, wearing ski gloves but no mask, because masks weren't a thing, And I love, there was a poem that I love is by Louis MacNeice. It's his great book poem called Autumn Journal, and it's written in the lead up to war breaking out. It's a young man's poem, and the personal and political. He writes to Eliot that it's a journalist poem. And at the start of the pandemic, a writer called Jonathan Gibbs, he started tweeting a sort of parody of Autumn Journal called Spring Journal. But it very quickly took on its own momentum. And so he published it. He wrote a canto a week. And it's published by CB Editions called Spring Journal. And I love that because it's written so close to events happening that in one canto it'll be like the goats of Llandudno. You know, it'll be the moment where suddenly the goats were like roaming the streets of Llandudno, or you know, it'll be like Boris Johnson suddenly being taken into intensive care. And I find it interesting that when we look back, even so recently after, it sort of blurs into this thing. So I'm more interested in sort of the specific moments, and I think that's what freed me up to write about the Blitz, seeing the Blitz not as one kind of like lump of a thing, but as people who didn't know where they were in it, trying to live, you know, very precisely in it from day to day. So I think if I do anything COVID related, it'll come at it kind of glancingly, or it'll be sort of pinpoints, you know, very precise moments, I think. Thank you. Yes, hi.
I was just thinking about what you were just saying about specific moments. One of the stories I really loved so much in Intimacies was the Monica Lewinsky one.
Thank you, yes.
And how you kind of honed in on that moment in history, which now, in today, it's so much more resonant, I think, almost at the time. But I love the way you wrote it, so with the text messages and stuff, which just made me think also, like, as a mum, you got the broken conversations that mothers have, and I just wondered, sorry, I've just lost track of my own question, how did it affect you as a writer after you had your kids, and did you feel it changed the way you wrote and the sort of things that you were interested in writing about?
Yeah, you got like about 3 brilliant questions
Sorry.
there. No, I like the WhatsApp stuff. Like I love the challenges of the way that we write, you know, and I love books on the grammar of how we communicate and all this sort of thing. Like Chekhov would totally have been, you know, writing WhatsApps and everything to his stories, you know. And I think I love the fact that, say, if I'm writing like a tweet, I always end them with exclamation marks because I'm of the generation that I can't end it with like just a full stop, you know, or I'll trail off or do dot. I'm so interested in those, they're tonal things about the way we communicate. And so that there's a lot of that in the story, you know, what we say, the ways we say it. The Monica Lewinsky, you know, the ways, that story is called Words for Things. You know, there are things that we didn't know were things because there were no words for them. And that story is specifically to do with motherhood because for me and for the purposes of my character in that story, motherhood was one of those moments. And I don't think you need to become a mother or a parent to have this moment, but for me it was one of those moments where you suddenly are able to take stock of time suddenly is different. You know, time starts moving in a different way. And I found with when I became a mother, there were things that I'd always sort of thought that I would do one day, stories I had always thought I would tell. And suddenly there was a sense of urgency to the telling of them that there hadn't been before. My time was a lot more limited. You know, even I didn't have the time that I had before, and so how I used it had to be more, it was more precious. The stories that I needed to tell suddenly seemed to matter more, you know, especially if I was paying a babysitter or if I was getting my husband to look after my child. In order for me to tell these stories needed to matter. And also I think that sometimes I think a lot of the work of writing is working out the stories that we tell ourselves that we don't even realise we're telling ourselves, you know, like the blueprints or the programs, you know, the sort of software that has been programmed into us that isn't serving us but that we keep running because we're not conscious of it. And for me, a huge program was, to go with that metaphor, was The Pram in the Hallway is the Enemy of Art, you know. And I had always thought that that having a child would be the end of my creative life as I knew it. That was just the way things were. And it was to my kind of surprise and shock that, and joy that after having children, I wrote better than I'd ever written before. I felt that my previous novels, something about them, they'd never been, you know, people talk about your own voice, and it felt like they'd never quite been written in my voice. And suddenly my short stories were. And it was something to do with, I think, anything that makes you vulnerable can only make you a better artist. I think as well that, I started writing and publishing very young, and so if that happens, you grow up in public and you're very aware of what people think of your work and people's comments on your work and reviews of your work. And suddenly having a child, and childbirth for me was very traumatic. It was very traumatic for me, and I was very ill afterwards. And my son was in intensive care wards. It very much felt like I had sort of touched like the face of death, or the veil that separates life from death was very, very thin in a way that I hadn't been aware of before. And I came away from that with I didn't care what people thought of my stories. I didn't care. I had for a while, I had this really freeing, blazing sense of complete freedom, of just not caring what anyone thought. And so something about that enabled me to tell the stories that I'd always wanted to tell, but some of them were stories of Belfast girlhood that I'd always thought, no one's going to be interested in these, what are these? Or stories that might have shameful material, or stories that I was worried people might think was about me. Suddenly all of that just fell away. So for me, motherhood was a great gift in all sorts of ways. But I think that we lack models. I have friends who are writers who have struggled with postpartum depression and psychosis and been unable to write. Friends who found it very hard to write again. But again, we lack all, the only model that I had of creative motherhood was this pram and hallway will be the end of it. Thank you. I hope I've answered some of your questions.
Well, I had a question, but you might have sort of answered it. But you talked about your early stories, feeling particularly about the stories that they hadn't quite worked or something, and then starting to work. And I guess this relates to partly what you just said. But did you know at the time with the stories that they weren't? Did you feel at the time they weren't really working? And if so, was there a breakthrough? Yeah, like a technical breakthrough rather than maybe just the life change breakthrough?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and it's something I talked about a little bit in the seminar earlier. Is I was writing stories. You could sort of feel that they're not. Sometimes they would have a sort of flicker of life, but they'd be basically inert. And the lines that I mentioned earlier that I love are from one of Sylvia Plath's poems called Stillborn, and she imagines all of her poems that don't work in sort of jars. And she says, they smile and smile and smile at me, but still their lungs won't fill, their hearts won't start. And I always felt that my stories, even though it would be like there'd be a good story, there'd be a good plot, there'd be good, and still they just weren't quite working. And I didn't know why. And there was no sort of light bulb moment or no radical technical breakthrough. Writing a lot of forms, I got technically better and better, more able to do what I wanted to do. But more so, it was when I made the mistake of seeing my short stories as miniature prose narratives. I'd seen a short story written in prose as just a sort of condensed version of a novel, also prose. And when my short stories really started working is when I started realising that they've got nothing to do with the novel at all. A short story, it can be, but it isn't necessarily a miniature plot. It's not a sort of novel in miniature. It's not a tale. And for me, my short stories started working when I started thinking of them, as I still often do, as spells. Rhythms and words in a particular order to evoke, particularly when I was writing my teenage stories, a feeling or a sensation or an atmosphere or a climate. And so in some of those stories, there might be a lot of plot, like a lot might be happening, it might be, and different characters and bits coincide, in some of them, there might be almost nothing happening, but how much happened or not, in terms of plot, was kind of secondary to the story. And as soon as I managed to start seeing the short story as something different, maybe something more akin to a poem, working out that when you're writing a short story, you're not just working with the story or with the plot, you're sort of corralling the invisible forces behind it, maybe much more like a poet does. Or like a play. People often say, short stories are brilliant for our time-poor lives, because they're short. And I think that's completely wrong. A short story, like a play, you have to read it in one sweep. A novel is very forgiving. You can read like 6 chapters of a novel on your commute, and then you can read 1 chapter in the bath. You can read 1 paragraph before bed, and if you lose your way, you can go back a few pages and pick it up and get back into it. Short story, you absolutely, as soon as you stop reading a short story, the spell is broken, you know. And a short story, you need to. I remember taking on a long plane journey, Kevin Barry's second collection, and I'd been like saving it up and saving it up and saving it up, thinking I'm going to read it with no interruptions on this flight. And it was a terrible choice to take on a flight. I would have been much better served by some this summer when I was travelling about on trains and coaches, and I read Susan Smith The 3-Body Problem, like all 3 volumes of it. And that's what you need on a long journey, like something completely immersive that will just carry you with it. Short stories, you finish one, you kind of close the book, you have to kind of get your breath back and psych yourself up again for the effort it takes to read a new one, because with a short story, it's very demanding. You're instantly, a lot of demands are made of the reader. You know, you're not given time to settle in, you're just instantly there. And a short story is at a pitch, at an intensity that maybe a play is as well, but that a novel wouldn't feel too much. A novel wouldn't work at that pitch and intensity. So when I started writing short stories like that, rather than trying to make them sort of miniature novels, they started working. When I started understanding more the sort of what the form was, the mysteries of it. Thank you for the question.
Okay. Well, unless there's one last question, I think our time is pretty much up. So I'd like to thank Lucy and point out that there are some of the books for sale. I don't know whether we have wine this evening, Tom, or not.
Forgot the wine.
No wine, but we can always go to the pub. And next week's event is?
Annie Domingo and Juliana Mensah, debut novels with Deirdre Osborne.
Right. Okay, so just remains for me to thank Lucy.
Thank you so
Fascinating.
much.
Really good to hear about that novel.